Okay. Here's another question from the same fellow, Gabe. Can you discuss more about Robert Adams? Since your video regarding Adams was released, there seems to be some increasing interest in Adams' work.
Shall we assume people know who he is, or shall we start from scratch?
Why don't you introduce him briefly?
Robert Adams was definitely at the mature end of the spectrum of spiritual seekers. He was a boy in America in the 1940s who had an extraordinary talent that whatever he thought about would manifest in front of him. So he could be outside the candy store, and he said, I had to say three. It was like the Candyman movie. You say candy, 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 and the candy would appear in his hand. Instead of a monster coming through the mirror, he'd get the candy in his hand.
It would just manifest? Or?
It would just manifest, yeah. I mean, he said it was the perfect city for a kid to have.
Yeah, wow.
And sometimes he said he would say, God, God, God. He came from a Christian background, so he thought he had to make some kind of divine appeal to get things. But he said it worked just as well if he just said, you know, ice cream, as God, God, God. So he went through life. Oh, and he said, when I was a child, this strange man in a diaper used to sit on my bed at night and talk nonsense and talk nonsense. So here we are, back to the Ramana appearing. Mm-hmm. So he never elaborated on whether the nonsense was because it was in Tamil or because it was abstract philosophy, or he just said he talked nonsense at the end of my bed. And as I grew up, he stopped coming, but for a long time, he'd come and sit on the end of my bed every night and talk nonsense. So in his early teens, he had a test at school, a maths test, and hadn't done his homework. He didn't need to with the city, so he just said, God, 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 waiting for the answer to his quadratic equation or whatever. And he said, instead of getting the answer, I got the experience of God, that somehow calling on God for help, God actually came as himself and gave me the experience. And he said that was it. I was in that state and I remained in that state. So he wasn't anyone who did a long, complicated practice. And he went off, of course, and this is 1940s America. It's not a very congenial environment to get any kind of context to this. So he first went off to Joel Goldsmith, who was a Christian mystic, who, interestingly enough, had very similar ideas to Bhagavan on I and I am. He was telling his Christian flock in the 1940s to focus on I am, realize God through I am. Then he gravitated to Yogananda, who was in probably California at that time. And he wanted to adopt Yogananda as his guru. Yogananda said, no, your guru is Ramana Maharshi in India. Yogananda could see that. So at a very young age, and by himself, 17 or 18, he got on an old prop plane, which must have taken half a week to get to India, showed up at Ramanashram, stayed there for the last 3 years of Bhagavan's life. Again, he's one of the people who, for decades, went completely below the radar. He didn't really surface in anyone's consciousness until about 1990, when he appeared in LA giving satsangs to people there. And then slowly his backstory came out. But you don't find him mentioned in any ashram book. You don't find any record of him at Ramanashram. So when my interest in him was piqued, I started asking around, and the only person who could remember him was Arthur Osborne's daughter. And she remembered him because she was very annoyed that her dad gave Robert Adams the family car, gave it away as a gift. I mean, can you imagine this? This cars are a rarity in the 40s, big status symbol. And Arthur Osborne was so impressed with this young teenager from America that he just gave him the car and said, go off on your pilgrimage, and they never saw their car again. So she still remembered that. But when I say Ramana was impressed, he personally gave him a room at Ramanashram. This is late 1940s, when the crowds were almost overwhelming, and then brought food to his room and personally served him in his room.
Wow.
To me, that is somebody scored a big hit with Ramana.
Yeah.
They never really had any big dialogues, big conversations. He just sat there. He absorbed the presence. I think if you want to run all the way around the world in search of a guru, something is still missing. You do need to have some authoritative confirmation of your state. He said, I got the state at 14. but he never quite says what Bhagavan did for him in his life. But I think he established him in that state, so he no longer needed to run around looking for gurus anymore. But he did, in a casual, let's say touristy way, he spent the 1950s, 60s hopping around India. He saw all the big names, Ananda Mahima, Nisargadatta, Swami Ramdas. You don't get many stories, but he seemed to have been a peripatetic Indian pilgrim for decades. Got married, he still has a widow still alive, a daughter somewhere, and then just lived a completely obscure life in America in around 1990s. Somebody put an advertisement in whatever the equivalent of Craigslist was in those days, saying, I'm a Ramana devotee, I'm looking for devotees to have a Ramana satsang, anybody like to join me? And who should turn up but Robert? And this man realized within 5 minutes this wasn't a casual walk-in off the street, this was somebody special. And he just said, you're a jnani, aren't you?
Wow.
And so, somehow Robert had that aura about him as somebody who knows. Robert, his early teachings were recorded in a manuscript that was entitled Silence of the Heart. And this manuscript came to Lucknow when I was there. And it was shown to Papaji. And Papaji said, I like this man's teachings. I'm going to read these out in satsang every day. This was the only living teacher I ever saw him praise, endorse, and take his teachings to satsang and read them out. He really did like the teachings. That they were so purely Ramana. Remember I told you about Morris being able to summarize Ramana's teachings even better. Robert had an ability to explain exactly what Bhagavan was teaching without using any technical terms, any Sanskrit, any Tamil, any philosophy. I can go through the whole of this book and I can't find a single word or comma that Ramana wouldn't sign off on. And he does it ad lib without any, it's not book knowledge, it's all from experience. He's talking about inquiry, he's talking about the nature of the self, he's talking about the role of the guru. And you just read this and you think, this is a man who knows, this is a man teaching from experience. He doesn't need big words, he doesn't need to cite from books or give anyone else's opinion. He's just talking from the heart about the self, which he got confirmed in Bhagavan's presence in the 1940s.